Sometimes true wealth isn't what we own, it's what we're willing to give away. In the high desert, an aging cowboy proved that truth. When Jed Monroe, 64 and down to his last possession, found two young sisters collapsing from hunger, he didn't hesitate. He gave them his horse. They rode off, and Jed walked on. But at dawn, the earth trembled. 200 donkeys appeared, led by a chieftain, the girl's father. He'd tested hearts through his daughters. What happens when a man with nothing meets a tribe that honors everything? Before we jump back in, I want to hear from you. Tell us where you're tuning in from in the comments, and if this story touches your heart the way it should. Make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The high desert of New Mexico holds a particular kind of silence. It's not the absence of sound, but rather the presence of something older than words, a stillness that settles into a man's bones and makes him reckon with what he's made of. For Jed Monroe, that silence had been both companion and judge for the better part of 30 years. His ranch, if you could still call it that, sprawled across 400 acres of sun-bleached earth and stubborn sage. The house was adobe, built by hands long turned to dust, with walls thick enough to keep the worst of the heat at bay. The barn leaned slightly to the east, weathered grey by decades of wind and sand. 3 fence lines marked the property's boundaries, though the wire sagged in places and several posts had given up their fight against gravity. Jed rose before dawn most mornings, not from habit so much as from the restlessness that comes with age. Sleep had become a shallow thing since Sarah passed 12 years now, though some mornings it felt like yesterday, and others like a lifetime ago. He'd pull on his boots, the same pair he'd been resoling for 15 years, and step out onto the porch to watch the sun climb over the Sangre de Cristo range. The view hadn't changed, but everything else had. Time moves different in the desert, fast and slow at once. A man can watch his whole life slip away while the rocks stay exactly the same. His morning routine was simple. Check on Copper, his sorrel gelding, the last horse left from what used to be a modest herd. Feed the chickens that still scratched around the yard, down to 4 now from the 20 Sarah used to keep. Walk the property line, checking for breaks he couldn't afford to fix. Return to the house and make coffee so strong it could wake the dead, which is how Sarah used to describe it, with that smile of hers that could light up a room darker than any desert night. The leather journal sat on the kitchen table where he'd left it the night before. 30 years of entries, written in a hand that had grown shakier with each passing season. He'd started it the day they bought the place, young and foolish and full of dreams about building something that would last. Sarah had laughed at him, called him sentimental, but she'd loved him for it all the same. He opened it sometimes, reading old entries about cattle drives that turned a profit, about the year they'd fixed up the barn, about the plans they'd made for children that never came. The later entries were different, shorter, harder. Notes about failed wells, vet bills that couldn't be paid, the month he'd sold off the last of the cattle, the day he'd buried Sarah under the cottonwood tree on the north section, where she'd always said the view was prettiest. The most recent entry was from 2 weeks back. Bank sent another notice. 3 months behind. Don't know what I'll do if they take this place. Don't know where I'd go. Jed closed the journal and took a long sip of coffee. The sun was fully up now, painting the desert in shades of gold and rust. He'd need to ride into town soon. Supplies were running low down to the last of the flour, nearly out of coffee, which was unacceptable. A man could survive on very little, but coffee wasn't negotiable. The problem was money, or rather, the lack of it. He had maybe $20 in cash, and the bank account had been overdrawn since March. Tom Hawkins, his nearest neighbor 8 miles to the west, had offered to buy Copper more than once. Good money, too enough to keep the ranch afloat for another few months, maybe longer if he was careful. But Jed couldn't do it. A man without a horse in this country might as well be a man without legs. Copper was 19 years old, past his prime like Jed himself, but still sound, still willing. They'd been through too much together for it to end at an auction or in some stranger's stable. "We'll figure something out," Jed said aloud to the empty kitchen. Talking to himself had become another habit of the solitary life. Always have before. That wasn't entirely true, and he knew it. The truth was that he'd been lucky, mostly. Lucky that Sarah had been a teacher and brought in a steady salary. Lucky that his back had held out as long as it did doing ranch work for other men. Lucky that the roof hadn't caved in yet, that the well still gave water even if it was getting slower each year, that his health was decent for a man pushing 65. But luck runs out. That's the nature of it, and Jed could feel his running thin as creek water in August. He stepped outside and walked toward the barn. Copper stood in the small corral, tail swishing at flies, head down as he dozed in the morning warmth. The horse lifted his head when Jed approached, nickering softly. "Morning, old friend," Jed said, running his hand along Copper's neck. The horse leaned into the touch. "What do you say we take a ride later? Need to get to town. See what we can manage." Copper's dark eyes regarded him with what seemed like understanding. Horses knew things. Jed had always believed that. They could sense trouble, feel the weight of worry in a man's touch. Sarah used to say that Copper was the smartest animal on the ranch, including Jed himself, and he'd never argued the point. The rest of the morning passed in the familiar rhythm of chores that barely needed doing anymore. There were no cattle to tend, no crops to water. Just a man and a horse, and a piece of land that was slowly returning to the desert it had been carved from. Jed found himself standing by Sarah's grave, something he did more often these days. The cottonwood tree provided good shade, its leaves rustling in the dry breeze. He'd carved her name into a piece of sandstone, along with the dates and a line from a poem she'd loved. "What we have once enjoyed we can never lose." "I'm losing the place, Sarah," he said quietly. "I'm sorry. I know we promised we'd keep it. Make it last." He paused, looking out over the land that rolled away toward the mountains. "But I can't see a way through this time. I'm down to the last of everything, including hope." The wind was his only answer, but somehow it was enough. Sarah had always said that worrying about tomorrow was a waste of today's peace. "One day at a time, Jed," she'd tell him. "That's all any of us get." He touched the stone marker gently and walked back to the house. The sun was high now, the heat building toward the afternoon peak that would drive even the lizards under rocks. He'd ride out in an hour or so, catch the cooler evening for the trip to town. Miller's Crossing was 20 miles northeast, a dusty collection of buildings that served the scattered ranches and homesteads of the region. Inside, he gathered what little he had to trade or sell. A pair of spurs he'd won in a roping competition 40 years back, a pocket knife with a bone handle, good steel, barely used, a silver belt buckle from his rodeo days. Things he'd held on to for reasons that seemed less important now when measured against an empty pantry. He packed them carefully in his saddlebag, then added a canteen of water and some jerky he'd made last month from a deer Tom Hawkins had shared. The journal he left on the table, open to a blank page. If he had anything worth writing about when he got back, he'd add it then. Jed stood in the doorway of his home and looked around at the simple room, the wood stove Sarah had cooked on, the table they'd eaten at together for 23 years, the shelf with her books, the ones she'd read to him on winter evenings when the wind howled and the cold crept through every crack. "I'll do right by this place," he said to the empty room, whatever that means now. Then he walked outside, saddled Copper with the easy motions of a lifetime's practice, and swung up into the seat with only a slight grunt of effort. His knees weren't what they used to be, but they still worked well enough. The ride to town would take him across open country, following old trails through arroyos and over mesas, painted in shades of red and gold. It was beautiful country if you had eyes. To see it hard and unforgiving, but honest. The desert never lied to you about what it was. As Copper carried him away from the ranch, Jed thought about his father, who'd been a cowboy in Texas, back when that word still meant something specific and hard. The old man had taught him a code that seemed out of fashion now, maybe always had been. A man's measure isn't in what he keeps, but in what he'd give to a stranger. Your word is your bond. Take care of your horse before you take care of yourself. Do right, even when it costs you. Jed had tried to live by those rules. He'd succeeded mostly, failed sometimes, but always circled back to them in the end. They were all he had left of his father, besides a faded photograph and a pair of spurs, the ones now in his saddlebag, about to become somebody else's property. Funny how things come full circle, he said to Copper. The horse's ears flicked back, listening. Start with nothing, end with nothing, and call it a life well lived if you helped a few folks along the way. The afternoon sun beat down as they crossed the first mesa, and Jed pulled his hat lower against the glare. Somewhere ahead was town, and whatever answers or disappointments it might hold, but right now there was only the land and the horse and the long road between where he'd been and where he was going. And for just this moment, that was enough. The trail to Miller's Crossing wound through country that could change character in the space of a mile flat hardpan, giving way to rocky rises, dense stands of juniper opening onto bare slopes scattered with yucca and prickly pear. Jed had ridden this route hundreds of times, knew every landmark, every place where water might gather after a rain, every spot where the footing got tricky. He was 3 hours out from the ranch when he saw them. At first, he thought it was heat shimmer playing tricks the way the desert could conjure images that weren't there, especially in the worst of the afternoon blaze. 2 dark shapes near a dried creek bed, motionless in the sun. But as Copper plodded closer, the shapes resolved into something that made Jed's chest tighten with concern. 2 girls, young, collapsed in a patch of thin shade, thrown by a juniper bush that wasn't much bigger than they were. Jed dismounted quickly, his knees protesting the speed, but his mind focused entirely on what he was seeing. The girls couldn't have been more than mid-teens, one maybe 14, the other 16 at most. They wore clothing he'd never seen before, woven garments in patterns of deep blue and brown, with intricate threadwork along the edges. Their dark hair was braided, and silver ornaments caught the light even in their stillness. "Hello," Jed called out softly, approaching slowly so as not to frighten them. "Are you hurt?" The older girl stirred slightly, her eyes opening to narrow slits. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her face burned dark by the sun. She tried to speak, but only a dry rasp came out. Jed knelt beside them, touching the younger one's forehead. Hot, dangerously hot. Dehydration, exposure, maybe both. He grabbed his canteen from Copper's saddle and returned quickly. "Easy now," he said, lifting the older girl's head gently and bringing the water to her lips. "Small sips. That's it. Not too fast." She drank desperately, but Jed controlled the flow. Too much too fast would make her sick. After a few moments he moved to the younger sister and did the same. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and unfocused, but she drank. The older girl tried to speak again. This time sounds emerged words in a language Jed didn't recognize, musical and flowing. Then she tried English, heavily accented and broken. "Thank you, senor. We walk long time, no water." "Sister," she gestured weakly to the younger girl. "How long have you been out here?" Jed asked. 2 days, maybe 3, she coughed, wincing. "We lost. Father, he sent us." She struggled for the words. "Test. To test. Hearts of people." Jed frowned, not fully understanding but knowing it didn't matter right now. What mattered was that these girls were in serious trouble. The nearest water was back at his ranch or forward to town. Either way was a long stretch, maybe too long for them to walk in their condition. He looked at Copper, standing patiently a few feet away. Then back at the girls. The calculation was simple and brutal. They wouldn't make it on foot. Even with water, the sun would finish what dehydration had started, but Copper could carry them. The problem was the rest of it. If he put them on Copper and they rode to town, what would he do? Walk 20 miles in the heat? He was in decent shape for his age, but he wasn't young. The desert didn't care about decent shape, and if something happened to him out here, these girls would be lost again. Maybe forever. But if he didn't give them the horse, they'd almost certainly die where they lay. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "A man's measure isn't in what he keeps. Jed stood and looked around, getting his bearings. They were roughly 8 miles from town, if he remembered correctly, closer than his ranch. If he could get them on Copper and pointed in the right direction, they could make it before nightfall. Someone in Miller's Crossing would help them get word to wherever they came from. And him, well, he'd figure something out. He always had. "All right," he said, more to himself than to them. He walked to Copper and began untying his saddlebags. He kept out the canteen and the jerky, redistributing them to his belt and pockets. Everything else, his trading items, his spare shirt, all of it he tied securely behind the saddle. Then he helped the older girl stand. She was unsteady, leaning heavily on him. "You can ride?" he asked. She nodded, though uncertainty flickered in her eyes. "Good. Your sister, too, both of you on the horse. Understand?" It took a moment for his meaning to register, and when it did, her eyes widened. "Your horse?" "No, senor. We cannot." "You can and you will," Jed said firmly but gently. "You won't make it otherwise. Town is that way," he pointed northeast. 8 miles, maybe a bit more. Stay on this trail. It'll take you straight there. Tell folks you need help. They'll take care of you." He lifted the younger sister carefully, surprised by how light she was, and set her on Copper's back. Then he helped the older one up behind her. Copper shifted slightly under the unfamiliar weight, but stood steady, the good horse he'd always been. Jed handed the reins to the older girl. "His name is Copper. He's old, but he's wise. He knows the way to town. Just give him his head and he'll get you there. Don't push him hard, let him walk his own pace. You hear me?" Tears were running down the girl's face now. "Senor, we cannot take your horse." "How will you—" "I'll manage," Jed interrupted. "I'm a stubborn old cowboy. We're hard to kill." He tried to smile, though his heart was already heavy with what he'd just done. "You tell your father, when you see him, that Jed Monroe says hello, and that his daughters are brave girls." The older sister reached into a pocket of her woven garment and pulled something out. A small stone, turquoise blue, polished, smooth. She pressed it into Jed's hand. "For you. For remember. For—" she searched for the word. "For honor." Jed closed his fingers around the stone. It was warm from being carried close to her body. "Go on now. Sun's not getting any cooler." He slapped Copper's rump gently, and the horse started forward at a steady walk. The girls looked back once, the older one raising her hand in farewell or blessing. Jed couldn't tell which. He raised his own hand in return. Then they were moving away, growing smaller against the vast backdrop of the desert, and Jed was alone. He stood there for a long moment, watching until they disappeared around a bend in the trail. The silence settled back in, heavier now. He looked down at the turquoise stone in his palm, then slipped it into his shirt pocket, next to his heart. "Well," he said to the empty air, "guess we're walking." He checked the sun's position, maybe 3 hours until dark. 8 miles to town was manageable if he kept a steady pace, but he'd be doing it in the worst heat of the day. He had water, at least. Not much, but enough if he was careful. Jed started walking, following the same trail where Copper's hoofprints were still fresh in the dust. His boots were good for riding, less ideal for long walks, but they'd hold up. Everything else would depend on how much his body could take. The desert stretched before him, endless and indifferent, but Jed Monroe walked with his back straight and his conscience clear. He'd done what needed doing. Given what needed giving, the rest would sort itself out, or it wouldn't. Either way, he'd be able to look himself in the mirror, assuming he made it to one. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd ridden out to save his ranch, and now he'd given away the one thing that might have saved it. But as the miles began to pass beneath his boots, as the heat pressed down and the sweat soaked through his shirt, Jed found he couldn't regret it. Some things mattered more than property, more than survival. Those girls had their whole lives ahead of them. His was mostly behind him. It was a fair trade, when you looked at it clear-eyed. A fair trade. Walking in cowboy boots wasn't the worst thing Jed had ever done, but it ranked somewhere in the upper tier of poor decisions. By the time he'd covered the first mile, he could feel blisters forming on both heels. By the second mile, his lower back had begun sending up complaints that would turn into full protests before long. But he kept moving, one foot in front of the other. The sun tracked slowly across the sky, and Jed rationed his water carefully, a sip every half hour, no more. The jerky helped somewhat, giving him something to work on, keeping his mouth from going completely dry. The trail was good, at least. Packed earth and rock, nothing too treacherous. He passed landmarks he knew by heart, a distinctive boulder shaped like a sitting bear, a lightning-struck juniper that stood white and skeletal against the red earth, an arroyo where flash floods had carved strange patterns into the sandstone walls. Time moved differently on foot. What took an hour on horseback stretched into 3 on foot, maybe more. Jed tried not to think about the miles still ahead, focusing instead on the ground immediately in front of him, on maintaining his pace, on keeping his breathing steady. His mind wandered to keep itself occupied. He thought about Sarah, about the way she used to worry when he stayed out later than expected. "You're not invincible, Jed Monroe," she'd say, "despite your best efforts to prove otherwise." He thought about the girls, wondering if they'd made it to town yet. Copper would have gotten them there. That horse had carried him through worse situations than this. The sun was low on the horizon when Miller's Crossing finally came into view, a scatter of buildings huddled together like they were trying to keep each other company in all that empty space. Jed felt a wave of relief so strong it nearly buckled his knees. He limped into town as the first lamps were being lit in windows. A few people were out, ranchers loading supplies into wagons, someone sweeping the porch of the general store. They looked at him curiously. It wasn't often a man walked into Miller's Crossing on foot, especially not Jed Monroe, who everyone knew by his sorrel horse. Jed. It was Martha Peterson, who ran the boarding house. "Where's Copper? You all right?" "I'm fine, Martha," Jed said, though his voice was rough from the dry air. "Copper here? Your horse?" "Sure is. Came in about 2 hours ago with 2 young girls on his back. Foreign girls, by the look of them. They're over at Doc Harrison's right now, getting checked out. Everyone's been worried about you. Girls kept saying something about a cowboy on the trail, but we couldn't make out much through their broken English." Relief flooded through Jed. "They made it safe." "Good. That's good." Martha looked at him more closely, taking in his dust-covered clothes, his obvious exhaustion. "Jed Monroe, what exactly happened out there?" "Long story," he said. "Right now I could use some water and a place to sit down that isn't moving." She ushered him into the boarding house, sat him in the front parlor, and brought him a pitcher of water and a tin cup. Jed drank slowly, savoring every swallow. His body was starting to register all its complaints now that he'd stopped moving, feet throbbing, back aching, legs trembling slightly from the exertion. Within 15 minutes, half the town seemed to know he was there. Doc Harrison showed up, insisting on looking at his feet. Tom Hawkins arrived with his usual concerned frown. Even Sheriff Mackay wandered over, though there was no law being broken. "Those girls are in decent shape, considering," Doc Harrison said as he bandaged Jed's feet. "Dehydration, sunburn, exhaustion, but they'll recover fine. They're tough little things. Keep asking about the cowboy who walks. I take it that's you?" "Gave them my horse," Jed said simply. "Seemed like the right thing to do at the time." Tom Hawkins shook his head in disbelief. "You walked 8 miles in this heat? Jed, you could have died out there." "Didn't, though," Jed pointed out. "I'm too ornery for that." "What were they doing out there alone?" Sheriff Mackay asked. Jed explained what little he'd understood from the older girl. Something about their father sending them. About a test. It didn't make complete sense to him, and it clearly puzzled the others too. "Well, wherever they're from, someone needs to come get them," Martha said practically. "Can't just leave them here indefinitely. Though they're welcome to stay until then. Poor things. I'd like to see them," Jed said, "if that's all right." "Make sure they're settled," Doc Harrison nodded. "They're resting in the room above my office." "Come on." Jed followed him up the exterior stairs, each step a reminder of what his body had been through. The room was small but clean, 2 beds, with the girls resting in them. They sat up when Jed entered, their faces lighting up with recognition and something deeper, gratitude, respect, emotion that transcended language. "Senor Cowboy," the older one said, smiling despite her obvious fatigue. "You live. We pray you live." "I'm tougher than I look," Jed said, returning the smile. "You girls did good. Copper got you here safe. Your horse is good horse," the younger sister said shyly. It was the first time he'd heard her speak. "Strong, kind, like you." Jed felt his throat tighten. "You rest now. Get your strength back. I'm sure your father will come for you. Soon." "He come," the older girl said with certainty. "He always come." That night, Jed slept on a cot in Martha's back room. She refused payment, wouldn't hear of it. His body ached in places he'd forgotten could ache, but sleep came quickly and heavily. He woke to the sound of thunder, except it wasn't thunder. It was something else, a low rumble that shook the floorboards, that rattled the window glass in its frame. Jed sat up, wincing as his protesting muscles reminded him of yesterday's walk. The sky outside was just beginning to lighten with dawn. The rumbling grew louder. Jed pulled on his boots, grimacing at the contact with his bandaged feet, and limped to the window. What he saw made him blink, certain he was still dreaming. A sea of grey-brown bodies moved toward the town. Donkeys, dozens of them, no hundreds of them. They filled the trail from horizon to town, a living flood of long ears and patient eyes, moving in organized lines like a military column. And at their head, mounted on a tall black horse, rode a man who could only be the father. He was older, perhaps Jed's age, with silver-streaked hair pulled back and a face carved by sun and wind into something both stern and noble. He wore traditional clothing similar to his daughter's, but richer, with more elaborate designs. Behind him, other riders kept the donkey herd moving in disciplined formation. The entire town was waking now, people emerging from buildings to stare at the spectacle unfolding before them. 200 donkeys don't arrive quietly. Jed pulled on his shirt and made his way downstairs and outside. His feet screamed at him, but he barely noticed. The man on the black horse had stopped in the town square. He sat straight and tall, scanning the gathered townspeople with dark eyes that missed nothing. When those eyes found Jed, they stopped. The man dismounted in one fluid motion and walked toward him. The crowd parted instinctively. Jed stood his ground, though he had no idea what was about to happen. The turquoise stone in his pocket seemed to grow heavier, warmer. The chieftain, because that's clearly what he was, stopped 3 feet away and studied Jed for a long moment. Then he spoke, his English accented but clear and precise. "You are the one called Jed Monroe, the cowboy who walks." "I am," Jed said quietly. "Though I'd prefer if we could skip the walking part going forward." The faintest hint of a smile touched the chieftain's weathered face. "I am called Narration. My people have traveled these lands since before the borders were drawn, before the names of countries were written down. We move with the seasons, following the old ways." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of ceremony. "My daughters tell me you gave them your only horse, your only means of survival in this country. You walked through killing heat so they might live." "Wasn't much of a choice," Jed said. "They needed it more than I did." "There is always a choice," Narek replied. "That is the nature of the test. My daughters were sent ahead of our caravan, as is our tradition when we enter new territory. They go without food, without water beyond what they can carry. They go to measure the hearts of those they meet. Most people pass them by. Some give water, a little food. Few give more. You gave everything." The gathered townspeople were silent, listening. Jed could feel their eyes on him, but his attention remained on the man before him. "In my culture," Narek continued, "there is a saying, the measure of wealth is not in possessions, but in what one gives to a stranger. You have shown true wealth, Jed Monroe, and among my people such generosity must be honored." He turned and gestured to the mass of donkeys that filled the street. "I have brought these as payment for what you have given my daughters. 200 donkeys, strong and healthy. They are yours. Jed stared at him, then at the animals, then back at the chieftain. Sir, that's very generous, but I can't accept. You can, and you will, Narek said, his tone brooking no argument but carrying no hostility. To refuse would dishonor both of us. My daughter's lives are worth far more than donkeys, but this is what I can give that might be of use to you. Jed struggled for words. I don't know the first thing about raising donkeys. I'm a cattleman by trade, or was, and my ranch, the land isn't in good shape. The well's running low, the fences are falling down. Then we will help you fix it, Narek said simply. My people know water. We know how to find it, how to dig wells that will not fail. We know animals and land. We will teach you what you need to know about donkeys. They are hardy creatures, wiser than cattle, more resilient. They can survive where horses cannot, thrive where other animals would starve. He stepped closer, his voice lowering so only Jed could hear. You are a man at the end of his resources, yes? I can see it in you. The bank threatens. The land is failing. You gave away your last hope because it was right to do so. Let me give you a new hope in return. Jed felt his eyes sting. He'd cried maybe 3 times in his adult life, when his father died, when Sarah passed, and the day he sold his last cow. This threatened to be the 4th. I don't know what to say, he managed. Say yes, Narek said. Say you will accept help when it is freely given. Say you will learn what we can teach. The rest will follow. Before Jed could respond, the older daughter appeared, moving through the crowd with her sister. They'd cleaned up, rested, and looked much stronger than yesterday. The older one carried something bundled in cloth. She approached and bowed slightly to her father, then turned to Jed. We bring gift also. For you, from us. She unfolded the cloth to reveal a woven blanket in intricate patterns of blue, brown, and silver thread. My sister and I make, for many months, we make for the one who passed the test. We not know it be you, but now we know it should be you. The younger sister stepped forward shyly. The pattern tells story, of generosity, of honor, of stranger who become family. You keep, you remember. Jed took the blanket, feeling the weight and quality of the weaving. It was beautiful work, the kind that took skill and time and care. This is too much, he said, his voice rough. Is not enough, the older daughter replied firmly, but is what we have. What we make with our hands and hearts. Narek placed a hand on Jed's shoulder. My people will camp outside your town for today, rest the animals. Tomorrow, you will lead us to your ranch. We will see what needs doing. You will see what is possible when people work together. Is this acceptable? Jed looked around at the townspeople. Tom Hawkins was grinning. Martha had tears on her cheeks. Doc Harrison nodded encouragingly. Even Sheriff Mackay looked pleased. It's acceptable, Jed said finally. More than acceptable. He paused, searching for adequate words and finding none. Thank you, all of you. Narek squeezed his shoulder once, then released it. Everything else is merely balance being restored. He turned to address the crowd. My people are peaceful. We make no trouble. We ask only for water for our animals and a place to rest for one day. Tomorrow we move on to help our new friend. You're welcome to use the creek north of town, Sheriff Mackay called out. Plenty of space there. Good grazing too. We appreciate your hospitality. Narek replied with a slight bow. As the chieftain walked back to organize his people and move the donkey herd to the camping area, Jed found himself surrounded by townspeople wanting to congratulate him, pat his back, express their amazement at what had just happened. Tom Hawkins pulled him aside. Jed, do you realize what this means? 200 donkeys. You could start a breeding operation, sell them to packers and miners. There's good money in donkeys these days, with all the prospecting going on. I haven't thought that far ahead, Jed admitted. Still trying to wrap my mind around the fact that I walked into town yesterday with nothing and I'm leaving tomorrow with all this. Sometimes the world surprises you, Martha said warmly. You did a good thing, Jed, a rare thing. It's right that good comes back to you. But as Jed stood there, clutching the woven blanket and watching the river of donkeys flow through Miller's Crossing toward the creek. He felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not just hope, but purpose. The sense that maybe, just maybe, his story wasn't over yet. That there were still chapters to be written, still work to be done, still life to be lived. He touched the turquoise stone in his pocket, smooth and warm, and thought about the strange path that had led him here. Yesterday, he'd been a broken-down cowboy, with nothing left to lose. Today, he was a man with 200 donkeys, a tribe of allies, and a future that suddenly looked a lot less certain to end in foreclosure and defeat. "One day at a time," he murmured, remembering Sarah's words. "That's all any of us get, but what a difference a day could make." The journey back to the ranch took most of the day, but it was a different kind of travel than Jed was used to. The caravan moved at the pace of 200 donkeys, which was slower than horses but steadier, more deliberate. Jed rode Copper, returned to him by the sisters with solemn ceremony, and found himself alongside Narek at the head of the column. "Your daughters mentioned you move with the seasons," Jed said as they rode. "Where do you come from originally?" "From the south," Narek replied. "Many generations ago, before the current borders existed. Our people are scattered now across many lands, but we maintain the old ways. We follow water and grazing. We trade our goods, weavings, metalwork, knowledge of animals and plants. We cause no trouble, but we are often not welcomed either." "People fear what they don't understand," Jed observed. "This is true everywhere." Narek glanced at him. "You do not fear us. Why?" Jed considered the question. "I've learned that a man's character shows in his actions, not his appearance or his customs. You came with honor. You came with gratitude. That's enough for me." "You are a wise man, Jed Monroe." "I'm a stubborn man," Jed corrected with a slight smile. "But I've had enough years to learn a few things." Behind them, the donkeys flowed like a grey river, managed by a dozen riders who worked with practiced efficiency. Jed noticed they were mostly younger men and women, all dressed in the same woven garments, all moving with the kind of coordination that came from years of working together. One of the riders, a man perhaps 30 years old with a quick smile, brought his horse up alongside them. "Father, we should reach the ranch by sunset, yes?" "If Jed's estimate is correct," Narek said. "Jed Monroe, this is Aaron, my eldest son." Aaron nodded respectfully. "We are grateful for your hospitality, Mr. Monroe. Call me Jed, and I should be thanking you. I'm still not entirely sure what I'm going to do with 200 donkeys." Aaron's smile widened. "We will show you. Donkeys are remarkable animals. Strong, intelligent, protective. They bond with other livestock, protect them from predators. Ranchers in many places are learning this. A few donkeys in a cattle herd can mean the difference between losing animals to coyotes and keeping them safe." "We don't have cattle anymore," Jed admitted. "Sold them off 2 years back when feed got too expensive." "Then perhaps we help you get cattle again," Narek suggested. "Or sheep, or both. Donkeys work well with many animals. They also carry loads better than horses over rough terrain. There are mining operations in the mountains that would pay good money for trained pack animals." Jed shook his head slightly, overwhelmed by possibilities he hadn't considered. "You've clearly thought this through more than I have." "We have traveled many places," Narek said, "seen many ways of living. We learn what works, what doesn't. We share what we know." When they finally reached the ranch, the sun was indeed setting, painting the adobe house and sagging barn in shades of gold and amber. Jed saw his property through new eyes now, not just as a failing enterprise, but as something that might be saved, might even thrive again. The caravan spread out across the open land. The donkeys were organized into smaller groups, each managed by specific handlers. Narek dismounted and walked the property with Jed, his experienced eye taking in everything: the condition of the fences, the state of the barn, the location of the house relative to the surrounding terrain. "Your well is there?" he asked, pointing to the old stone structure near the barn. "Yes, it's been getting slower each year. I figure it's maybe 2 years from running dry completely." Narek called out in his own language. A woman, perhaps 40 years old, approached, carrying what looked like a leather satchel. She had the same weathered dignity as Narek, her hair silver-streaked and pulled back. "This is Zara," Narek said. "She is our water finder. Best I have ever known." Zara bowed slightly to Jed, then spoke in accented English. "I may walk your land? Look for water?" "Please," Jed said, curious. She opened her satchel and removed 2 objects, copper rods, each about 18 inches long, bent at 90-degree angles. Jed had heard of water witching before, though he'd never put much stock in it. But he wasn't about to argue with people who'd survived as nomads for generations. Zara held the rods loosely, one in each hand, parallel to the ground. Then she began walking slowly, her eyes half closed, her breathing steady. Jed, Narek, and Erin followed at a respectful distance. She walked past the current well without stopping, moved toward the north section of the property, where the land rose slightly toward a rocky outcropping. Her pace was unhurried but purposeful, as if listening to something the rest of them couldn't hear. Suddenly the rods in her hands swung inward, crossing each other sharply. Zara stopped, opened her eyes, smiled. "Here," she said simply. "Good water. Close to surface. Maybe 15 feet. Strong flow." "You're certain?" Jed asked. "I am certain." She drove a stick into the ground to mark the spot. "We dig here tomorrow." "You will see." Narek nodded with satisfaction. "We also fix your current well. Clean it. Line it properly. 2 wells better than 1. You will not worry about water again." As darkness settled, the caravan made camp. Fires were lit, food prepared. The smell of cooking filled the air, spices Jed didn't recognize, but that made his mouth water nonetheless. He was invited to share their meal and found himself sitting cross-legged on the ground with Narek, Zara, Erin, and the 2 daughters whose names he finally learned, Lena and Mira. They ate from communal bowls, passing food and conversation in a mixture of English and their own language. Jed learned that they'd been traveling for 4 months on this particular circuit, trading goods in various towns and settlements, always moving, always searching for the next place that might welcome them, even temporarily. "Don't you ever want to settle?" Jed asked. "Find a permanent place?" Narek shook his head. "The moving is who we are. We settle in our hearts, not in buildings. Our home is where our people are, not where the ground is. Must be hard, though, always being the outsider. Sometimes," Lena said quietly, "but sometimes we meet good people, like you. That makes it worth the hard times." After the meal, as Jed prepared to retire to his own house, Narek walked with him. "Tomorrow we begin work. The well first, then we assess everything else. My people will stay as long as needed, a week, maybe 2. We teach you about the donkeys, help you establish the beginnings of an operation. Then we must move on. But we will return this way next year, check on your progress. This is not a one-time thing, Jed Monroe. You have earned not just our help, but our friendship." Jed felt that tightness in his throat again. "I don't know how to thank you properly. You already did, when you gave my daughters your horse. Everything else is just details." That night, Jed lay in his bed and stared at the ceiling. Outside, he could hear the sounds of the camp, low voices, the occasional bray of a donkey, the crackle of fires. His ranch, silent and dead for so long, was alive again with purpose and possibility. He thought about Sarah, wished she could see this. She'd always believed in the goodness of people, in the possibility of second chances. "Life isn't over until you decide it's over," she used to say. Well, he hadn't decided it was over, not yet, and tomorrow they'd dig a well. The digging began at dawn. Jed had expected it to take days, maybe weeks, but Narek's people worked with an efficiency that spoke of long practice. They had tools Jed had never seen, specialized shovels, rope systems, buckets designed for hauling rock and soil. 6 men took turns in the hole, working in shifts so no one exhausted themselves. Zara supervised, occasionally feeling the soil that came up, smelling it, even tasting it. Jed watched, fascinated by the certainty in her movements. By midday, they'd gone down 12 feet. Jed was beginning to doubt, wondering if maybe the water finding had been wishful thinking. But Zara remained confident. Soon, she kept saying, very soon. At 14 feet, the soil came up dark and damp. At 15 feet, water began seeping into the hole. By 16 feet, it was flowing steadily, clear and cold. The men in the hole shouted up in triumph, and the camp erupted in celebration. Jed stood at the edge of the new well, staring down at water that sparkled in the afternoon sun. His throat was tight with emotion he couldn't quite name. After years of watching his resources dwindle, here was abundance, appearing as if summoned by faith alone. "You see," Narek said beside him, "the land still has life in it. It just needed people who knew how to find it." Over the next 3 days, the transformation of Jed's ranch was remarkable. The new well was properly lined with stone. The old well was cleaned and reinforced. Fences were repaired using wood from dead trees on the property that Jed had been too weary to harvest himself. The barn received patching on its roof and new hinges on doors that had been hanging crooked for years. But it was the work with the donkeys that truly began to change Jed's perspective. Aaron took charge of his education. They started each morning in the corral with a dozen of the calmest animals. "Donkeys are not horses," Aaron explained. "They think differently. A horse will flee danger. A donkey will assess it. They are cautious, yes, but also brave. They will defend what they consider theirs." Jed learned to read their body language, the position of ears, the set of their heads, the way they breathed. He learned that donkeys bonded deeply with those who treated them well, but would never forget mistreatment. He learned that they could survive on forage that would starve a horse, that they could go longer without water, that they were naturally resistant to many of the diseases that plagued other livestock. "In towns to the west," Aaron told him, "ranchers pay $50 for a good donkey to guard their sheep. You have 200. Even if you keep 50 for your own operation, you could sell the rest for serious money." "And what would my operation look like?" Jed asked. Aaron smiled. "We've been thinking about this. You have 400 acres, good land, just neglected. With 2 wells, you can support maybe 30 donkeys permanently, plus rotation grazing. You breed them, jennies, produce foals every year if conditions are right. You sell the young stock to packers, ranchers, anyone who needs strong animals. You also offer training services. Many people buy donkeys, but don't know how to work with them. You become known as the man who understands donkeys. People come to you, you build reputation, then business." It was more ambition than Jed had allowed himself to feel in years. "That's assuming the bank doesn't take the land first. How much do you owe?" Narek asked. He'd approached quietly, listening to the conversation. Jed told him a number that felt insurmountable, that had haunted his sleep for months. Narek was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his shirt and pulled out a worn leather pouch. From it, he removed a silver medallion on a chain. It was old, intricately carved with patterns that hurt the eyes to follow. "This has been in my family for 7 generations, Narek said. "It is worth considerable money to the right buyer. Enough to pay your debt, I think." "I can't accept that," Jed said immediately. "It's your family's history." "And you saved my family's future," Narek replied. "My daughters. Without them, there is no 8th generation. The medallion is beautiful, but it is just metal and memory. My children are alive because of you. This is an easy trade." "Narek, I will hear no argument," the older man said firmly. "But I will make you a deal. Take the medallion. Sell it if you must, to save your land. But if your business succeeds, if the donkeys provide as we believe they will, then you buy it back from whoever purchases it. You return it to me when we pass through next year. If you cannot buy it back, then it was meant to be sold. This is acceptable?" Jed looked at the medallion, then at Narek's weathered face. The man was serious, his eyes steady and certain. "That's more than acceptable. That's a gift I can never fully repay." "You already repaid it," Narek said. on a trail in the desert when you gave everything you had. Now stop arguing with me like a stubborn mule and accept help when it's offered." That evening, Tom Hawkins rode up to the ranch. He stopped at the edge of the property, staring at the transformed landscape, the activity, the repaired structures, the organized herds of donkeys grazing peacefully. "Jed," he called out, "is that really you?" Jed walked over, grinning. "Still me. Just got some help from friends." Tom dismounted, looking around with undisguised amazement. "In 3 days they've done all this? How is that even possible?" Turns out, when you have people who know what they're doing and work together, a lot is possible. Jed gestured toward the camp. "Come on, I'll introduce you." Over the next hour, Tom met Narek, Aaron, Zara, and others. The initial wariness on both sides melted quickly. Tom was a practical man, and he could see quality work when he encountered it. "Jed, this could really work," Tom said later, as they stood by the new well. "You could make a real go of this, build something sustainable." "That's the plan," Jed said. "First step is dealing with the bank. Narek's helping me with that. And after, I learn everything these people can teach me. I build a donkey operation. Maybe get some cattle back eventually, like Aaron suggested. Take it one day at a time and see where it leads." Tom clapped him on the shoulder. "I'm glad, Jed, really glad. You've had a rough few years. It's good to see things turning around." That night, Jed sat with his journal, the first time he'd opened it since before the trail encounter. He wrote about the girls, about Copper carrying them to safety, about the caravan arriving like something from a dream. He wrote about the new well, the repaired fences, the possibilities opening up like flowers after rain. And he wrote, "Sarah, if you're watching, somehow, I hope you're proud. I gave away our horse and got back a future. Strange how that works, but I think you'd say I did the right thing. You always believed that doing right eventually circles back around. Maybe you were onto something." He closed the journal and stepped outside. The camp was settling for the night, fires burning low, voices murmuring in the darkness. Somewhere a donkey brayed, and another answered. The sound was becoming familiar, almost comforting. Jed pulled out the turquoise stone and the silver medallion, holding one in each hand, 2 pieces of other people's history now woven into his own. 2 symbols of connection, of trust given and received. He'd walked into the desert with nothing and come back with everything. Not everything he'd lost. Sarah was still gone, those years still empty. But everything he needed to build something new, something that mattered. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes that was more than enough. The discovery came on the 5th day, when Aaron's crew was digging a drainage channel from the new well to a collection trough for the animals. The shovel hit something that rang with a hollow ceramic sound. Aaron stopped immediately and called for Zara. She came quickly, kneeling beside the shallow trench. Carefully, she brushed away soil to reveal the curved edge of pottery, old pottery. By the look of it, not the crude, broken bits you might find anywhere, but something whole, deliberately buried. Within an hour, they'd uncovered 3 clay vessels, each sealed with wax and resin. The designs on them were intricate geometric patterns mixed with images of animals and symbols that none of them recognized. The pottery was old enough that the clay had taken on the color of the earth around it. Narek was called. He examined the vessels with careful reverence, his expression growing more serious with each piece. Finally, he looked up at Jed with something complicated in his eyes. "These are markers," he said quietly. "Sacred markers. Very old. My people, the ancestors of my people, we were not the only ones who moved through these lands. There were others, long before the Spanish came, before the Americans. These vessels mark something important, a place of significance." "What kind of significance?" Jed asked. "That depends on what's inside them," Narek replied. "We should open them, but carefully, with respect." They gathered in Jed's house, Narek, Jed, Zara, Aaron, and Lena, who had studied with tribal historians and could read some of the old symbols. The first vessel was opened with painstaking care. Inside was a scroll of preserved leather covered in pictographic writing. Lena examined it closely, her lips moving as she worked through the meaning. "It's a record," she said finally. "A boundary marker. This land was—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. It was a neutral meeting ground, a place where different tribes could come to trade, to negotiate, to make peace. Sacred ground, no violence permitted, no ownership claimed. It belonged to all and to none. "How old is this?" Jed asked. "Very old. Maybe 300 years. Maybe more." Lena continued reading. "The markers were placed by the last great council before the Spanish pushed into this region, and everything changed. 4 vessels buried at the cardinal points. You've found the northern marker. The second vessel contained similar documents, more detailed maps showing the extent of the sacred territory. Jed's ranch sat almost exactly at the center of it. The third vessel contained something unexpected, a detailed clay tablet with what appeared to be a legal document, written in Spanish, but clearly translated from earlier native records. It was a grant, signed by a Spanish official in 1751, formally recognizing the sacred nature of the land and prohibiting its sale or settlement. "This is remarkable," Zara said. "This document, if it's legitimate, it could have legal weight even now." Spanish land grants were honored by Mexico, and many were honored by the United States when they took this territory. Jed felt his stomach drop. "You're saying my ownership of this land might not be valid?" "I'm saying it's complicated," Zara replied carefully. The implications settled over the room like dust after an explosion. Jed had bought this property 30 years ago from a man whose family had owned it since the 1882nd. Standard sale, proper deed, everything legal and documented. But if there was an older claim, a sacred designation that predated all of that. "This explains some things," Narek said slowly. "Why this land has always felt different. Why water flows here when it should not. Why my people's paths have always bent toward this place when we travel north." He looked at Jed with sympathy. "I am sorry. We did not know this would come to light. It's not your fault," Jed said, though his mind was reeling. Better to know than not know. The next morning brought more complications. A well-dressed man arrived at the ranch in a new truck, accompanied by Sheriff Mackay. The man introduced himself as Leonard Cutler, representing the State Historical Society. "Mr. Monroe," Cutler said, his tone professionally pleasant, "we've received word about some archaeological finds on your property. I'd like to examine them if you don't mind." Jed had no choice but to show him the vessels and their contents. Cutler's eyes lit up with the fervor of a man who'd found exactly what he hoped to find. "This is extraordinary," Cutler said. "These documents, if authenticated, represent some of the most significant historical evidence we've discovered in this region. The combination of native records and Spanish recognition, it's unprecedented." "What does it mean for my ownership?" Jed asked bluntly. Cutler's expression became more guarded. "That would be a matter for the courts to decide, but I should inform you that there are provisions in state law regarding lands of historical and cultural significance. In cases where sacred sites are identified, there can be restrictions on private ownership and development." "Development?" Jed almost laughed. "I'm trying to keep the place from falling into ruin. That's not exactly development. Nevertheless, this matter will need to be reviewed. I'll need to take the vessels and documents for authentication and study. You'll receive full documentation of their removal, of course." Jed looked at Narek, who nodded slightly, a gesture that said both, "This is necessary," and "I'm sorry." After Cutler left with the artifacts, carefully packed and recorded, Sheriff Mackay lingered. "Jed, I got to tell you. This complicates things. The bank's already pushing for foreclosure. Now you've got a potential historical claim on the property. Courts could tie this up for years." "Which means what?" Jed asked, though he already knew. "Means you can't sell it to pay your debts, even if you wanted to. Means the bank can't foreclose and auction it either. Means everything goes into legal limbo until the historical question is settled. Could be months, could be years." After the sheriff left, Jed sat on his porch with Narek. The sun was setting again, painting the desert in those impossible colors that never got old no matter how many times you saw them. "I have made things worse for you," Narek said quietly. "My people brought this to light. Your people found water and fixed my fences and gave me donkeys," Jed replied. "This other thing, it was always here, just buried. Better to face truth than live on borrowed time built on ignorance. What will you do?" Jed was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know yet, but I'm starting to think maybe this isn't about ownership at all. Those old records talked about neutral ground, a place that belonged to everyone. Maybe that's what it should be again." "You would give it up?" "I don't know if it was ever really mine to give up," Jed said. "But I know I'm not going to fight to keep something that was never supposed to be owned in the first place. There's got to be another way, a way that honors what this place was, what it could be." Narek studied him for a long moment. "You continue to surprise me, Jed Monroe. Most men would fight, would lawyer up, as you say, would try to protect their claim at any cost. Most men haven't had the few weeks I've had," Jed replied. "I gave away my horse and got it back along with 200 donkeys and a future I thought was dead. I learned that sometimes letting go is the only way to receive. Maybe that lesson applies here too." That night, Jed couldn't sleep. He walked out to Sarah's grave under the cottonwood tree and sat with his back against the trunk. "It's all coming apart again," he said to the darkness, "just when I thought we might save it. But maybe that's the point. Maybe I'm not supposed to save it the way I thought. Maybe there's a bigger picture I'm not seeing yet." The wind rustled through the cottonwood leaves Sarah's voice. "If you believed in such things." And tonight, Jed chose to believe. "All right," he said. "I'll trust it. Whatever comes next, I'll face it like you taught me, with dignity and faith that things work out the way they're supposed to." He stood and walked back to the house, where lamplight spilled from windows and the sounds of the camp settled into night rhythms. Inside, he opened his journal to a fresh page. "Discovered today that this land is sacred ground," he wrote. "Belonged to everyone once, which means it maybe never should have belonged to just me. I don't know what happens next, but I know that the right thing is rarely the easy thing, and I know that I'd rather lose this place standing on principle than keep it by ignoring truth." He paused, then added, "Sarah always said that when life throws you into deep water, you either learn to swim or you drown. I'm choosing to swim, just not sure yet what shore I'm swimming toward." He closed the journal and extinguished the lamp. Tomorrow would bring new questions, new complications, but tonight he'd made his peace with uncertainty, and somehow that felt like solid ground. The idea came to Jed 3 days later while he was working with the donkeys. Aaron was teaching him about herd management, how to identify which animals were natural leaders, which were followers, which had the temperament for guard work versus pack work. As Jed watched the animals interact, forming their own social structures and hierarchies without human interference, something clicked in his mind. These animals didn't need to be owned to be managed. They needed to be understood, respected, worked with. The land was the same. It didn't need an owner, it needed stewards. That evening, he called a meeting. Not just Narek and his people, but Tom Hawkins, Martha Peterson from town, Sheriff Mackay, and Doc Harrison. He'd sent word to the State Historical Society too, asking Leonard Cutler to attend. To his surprise, everyone came. They gathered in Jed's house and spilled out onto the porch, lanterns casting warm light into the desert darkness. Jed stood before them, feeling every one of his 64 years, but also feeling more certain than he'd been about anything since Sarah died. "I've been thinking about this land," he began, "about what those old documents said, about what it was supposed to be. And I've been thinking about what I learned these past couple weeks, about giving things away and getting back more than you gave. About how some things aren't meant to be owned, just protected." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I can't claim to own sacred ground. That doesn't sit right with me, even if the law says I can. But I also can't just walk away and let it get sold to someone who'll turn it into something it was never meant to be. So, I've got a proposal." Leonard Cutler leaned forward with interest. "I'm listening. What if we turn this cutlass place into what it was supposed to be, a neutral meeting ground, a shared space, but for our time, not 300 years ago? Jed looked around at the gathered faces. I've got 200 donkeys now, thanks to Narek. I've got knowledge about working with them. I've got land that can support a sustainable operation. What if we make it a cooperative? A place where Narek's people can camp when they pass through, where local ranchers can bring livestock to train with guard donkeys, where we teach people about sustainable ranching and land management. A cooperative? Tom Hawkins asked. You mean shared ownership? I mean no ownership, Jed corrected. Or ownership by everyone involved. We set it up as a trust. The land stays protected for its historical significance, but it gets used in ways that honor what it was, a place where different people came together for mutual benefit. Narek's eyes were bright with understanding. You would create the meeting ground again. For the modern age, that's the idea, Jed said. My bank debt gets satisfied by the value contributed to the trust, the land itself, the improvements we've made, the donkey herd. Your people get a permanent stopping place on your circuit with rights to use the land and resources. Local ranchers get access to training and guard animals. The historical society gets a protected site that's actually being used, not just roped off and forgotten. It's an interesting concept, Cutler said slowly, but complex to implement. You'd need legal structures, agreements about usage rights, management protocols. I know a lawyer in Santa Fe, Tom said, specializes in land trusts and conservation easements. If anyone could draw this up properly, it'd be her. Martha spoke up. I think it's beautiful, Jed. It honors the past and creates something useful for the future. But what about you? Where do you fit in all this? Jed smiled. I'd be the manager, the steward, same as I've always been, just with a different understanding of what that means. I'd live on the land, care for it, teach what I'm learning about the donkeys, help coordinate the various uses. I wouldn't own it, but I'd belong to it. That's enough for me. Sheriff Mackay cleared his throat. Still leaves the bank. They're not going to just forgive the debt out of the goodness of their hearts. What if the trust bought the debt? Aaron suggested. If multiple parties contribute Narek's tribe, local ranchers who want access, maybe the historical society, the cost could be distributed. The bank gets paid, the land gets protected, everyone involved gets something valuable. My people would contribute, Narek said immediately. This would give us something we've never had a permanent place to return to, worth more than money can measure. I'd put in, Tom said. Been wanting access to good guard donkeys for my sheep operation. This would be perfect. Others began voicing support. Martha offered to help organize. Community fundraising. Doc Harrison mentioned a grant program for historical preservation. Cutler admitted that the Historical Society had discretionary funds for exactly this kind of project. As the conversation flowed, Jed felt something building, not just a plan, but a movement. Something larger than his individual struggle to save his ranch. This was about community, about different groups finding common ground, literally and figuratively. The meeting lasted until after midnight. By the end, they had the outline of something workable. Tom's lawyer contact would be brought in to structure it properly. Narek would consult with his tribal council about long-term commitment. The Historical Society would initiate the paperwork for heritage site designation with protective use provisions. Local ranchers would form a cooperative association to manage access and contributions. After everyone left, Jed sat with Narek under the stars. Think it'll work? Jed asked. I think it's worth trying, Narek replied. But there will be obstacles. There always are when you try to do something new, something that doesn't fit old patterns. I'm used to obstacles, Jed said. Seems like that's most of what life is. Obstacles and the spaces between them. Wise words, Narek said. He was quiet for a moment, then continued. You know, when I sent my daughters ahead on the test, I did not expect them to meet someone like you. I expected perhaps a small kindness, a gift of water. That would have been enough to warrant our respect and some token payment. But you gave everything, and now you are giving everything again, your claim, your ownership, your individual control. You keep giving away what others would fight to keep. Maybe that's because I learned the hard way that what you clutch too tight tends to slip through your fingers anyway, Jed said. Sarah taught me that. She'd give away her last dollar to someone who needed it. Drove me crazy sometimes how generous she was. But she was always happier than me. Lighter. Like she understood something I didn't. And now you understand? Starting to, Jed admitted. Starting to see that the good life isn't about what you accumulate. It's about what you give away and what you build with other people. Took me 6 decades to figure that out, but better late than never. The next week was a blur of activity. Tom's lawyer, a sharp woman named Elena Cortez, arrived from Santa Fe and immediately grasped the vision. She'd worked on similar projects for indigenous groups and conservation organizations. Within 3 days, she drafted a preliminary trust structure that satisfied legal requirements while preserving the spirit of what they were trying to create. The bank proved more difficult. The manager, a man named Winters, who'd sent Jed numerous foreclosure notices, was skeptical. This is highly irregular, he kept saying. Trusts, cooperatives, multiple stakeholders, it's complicated. So is foreclosing. On sacred ground, Elena replied smoothly. Especially when there's legitimate historical claim predating your mortgage. You could spend years in court, or you could accept payment in full from the trust and walk away clean. Your choice. Winters chose the pragmatic option. The bank would accept trust payment of the outstanding debt, with interest, provided the funds were guaranteed and delivered within 60 days. That deadline became the new focus. Narek's tribe committed a substantial amount raised from sale of goods and from their collective savings. Tom organized the local rancher association, and 15 families pledged contributions in exchange for cooperative access rights. The Historical Society allocated emergency preservation funds. Martha organized a community fundraiser in Miller's Crossing that raised more than anyone expected. As the pieces came together, Jed spent his days working on a new document, not for lawyers or banks, but for the land itself. It was a declaration of purpose, written in simple language, explaining what the trust was meant to achieve and how it should be managed. He wanted future generations to understand not just the legal structure, but the spirit behind it. He wrote about the old meeting ground and its purpose, about the importance of neutral spaces where different people could come together, about stewardship versus ownership, about sustainability and respect for the land, about building community through shared purpose. Lena helped him translate portions into her people's language. Elena ensured the legal language matched the intent. Tom offered practical additions about ranch management and resource sharing. The result was a document that was part legal agreement, part philosophical statement, part vision for a different way of relating to land and each other. They called it the Sacred Ground Trust Covenant. On the 58th day after the bank's deadline was set, they had the full amount. Every contribution was documented, every contributor given formal rights and responsibilities in the trust. Elena filed the necessary paperwork with the county and state. The Historical Society officially designated the site as protected. Narek's tribal council gave their formal blessing. The closing was scheduled for the 60th day, the absolute deadline. They would meet at the bank in Miller's Crossing, sign the final documents, transfer the funds, and officially establish the trust. The night before, Jed couldn't sleep. He walked the property in the moonlight, Copper following him lazily. The donkeys were settled in their various pastures. The wells flowed clean and strong. The fences stood straight. The barn no longer leaned. The land looked cared for in a way it hadn't in years. He ended up at Sarah's grave, as he so often did when he needed to think clearly. "Tomorrow it becomes official," he told her. "Tomorrow I give away what we built together. But somehow, I think you'd approve. You always said property should serve people, not the other way around. This is me finally understanding what you meant." The wind moved through the cottonwood leaves, and Jed chose to hear approval in it. Tomorrow would be the beginning of something new, something that honored what was while creating space for what could be. He was ready. The bank's conference room had never held so many people. Winters had protested at first. This is a simple closing, not a town meeting, but Elena had firmly explained that this was no simple closing. This was the establishment of a legal entity involving multiple stakeholders, and they all had a right to be present for the signing. So they came. All of them. Narek and his core council members, dressed in their finest woven garments. Tom Hawkins and 14 other local ranchers, wearing their best shirts and cleanest hats. Martha Peterson and a delegation from Miller's Crossing. Leonard Cutler from the Historical Society with his team. Sheriff Mackay, there in an official capacity but also as a witness to something he'd later call the most remarkable legal proceeding he'd ever seen. And Jed, at the center of it all, wearing the same clothes he'd worn to marry Sarah 42 years ago. A little tight now, a little worn, but still good. Elena laid out the documents on the long conference table. There were 3 sets, each representing a different aspect of what they were creating. The first was the trust establishment paperwork, dry legal language that nonetheless represented something revolutionary. The second was the deed transfer, moving ownership from Jed Monroe as individual to the Sacred Ground Trust as entity. The third was the covenant itself, the document Jed had labored over that would guide all future decisions about the land. "We'll start with the financial settlement," Elena announced. She presented Winters with a cashier's check for the full amount of Jed's debt, plus accrued interest. The banker examined it carefully, then nodded with satisfaction. "The debt is satisfied," he declared. "Mr. Monroe, you are released from all mortgage obligations." Jed felt something lift from his shoulders, a weight he'd carried so long he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to stand without it. But there was no time to dwell on that relief. They were moving forward. "Next, the trust establishment," Elena continued. She read through the key provisions. The land would be held in perpetual trust. Management would be shared among 3 parties. Representatives from Narek's tribe, the local rancher cooperative, and the Historical Society. Jed Monroe would serve as primary steward for as long as he was able, with succession to be determined by consensus of all parties. The trust's stated purposes were read aloud: to preserve the historical and sacred significance of the land, to provide sustainable educational and economic opportunity through responsible livestock management, to serve as a meeting ground and neutral space for diverse groups to work together toward common goals, to model cooperative land use that honors both past and future. One by one, the representatives signed the establishment documents. Narek signed with his hand steady and his expression solemn. Tom Hawkins signed with visible emotion, his weathered hand shaking slightly. Leonard Cutler signed with the precise flourish of a man who appreciated historical significance. Jed signed last. As he put pen to paper, he felt the finality of it, but also the rightness. He was giving away something he'd fought to keep for decades. But in giving it away, he was ensuring it would last beyond his lifetime, that it would serve purposes larger than his own survival. "Now the deed transfer," Elena said. She slid the document across to Jed. This was the moment. The actual relinquishing of ownership. Jed looked at the deed, his name still on it. For these last few moments, he thought about the day he and Sarah had signed the original purchase papers, young and full of dreams. He thought about the years of work, the struggles, the losses. He thought about Sarah buried under the cottonwood tree, part of this land forever. "You okay?" Tom asked quietly beside him. "Yeah," Jed said. "I'm good," he signed. His signature was steady, clear. Below his name, Elena had already prepared the transfer line, from Jed Monroe, individual, to the Sacred Ground Trust, in perpetuity. Narek stood and placed his hand on Jed's shoulder. "What you do today," he said, his voice carrying to everyone in the room, "is the act of a truly wise man. You give away power to create something lasting. You release control to invite partnership. This is the hardest gift and the most valuable, Speech, speech, someone called out. Jed thought it might be Martha. He stood, not quite sure what to say. He'd never been much for public speaking. But looking around at all these faces, people who'd come together around an idea, a vision of something better, he found words. "I'm not a man given to fancy speeches," he began. "But I want to say this. A few weeks ago, I was down to my last possession, and I gave it away. Every practical bone in my body said it was foolish, but something deeper said it was right. And that choice led to all of this." He gestured at the gathered people, the signed documents. "I learned something important. When you hold on too tight, you strangle what you're trying to save. But when you open your hands and give freely, sometimes the whole world gives back. That's what happened to me. And that's what I hope this trust will be, a place where giving and receiving flow both ways, where different people can find common ground, where we build something that outlasts any one of us." His voice wavered slightly at the end, but he pushed through. "My wife Sarah used to say that property should serve people, not the other way around. Took me most of my life to understand what she meant. But I understand now. This land doesn't belong to me anymore, never really did. It belongs to its own history and its own future. We're just privileged to be stewards of it for a while." There was silence for a moment. Then Tom Hawkins started clapping. Others joined in until the small conference room filled with applause. Jed felt his face flush, uncomfortable with the attention but deeply moved by the response. "The final document," Elena said when the applause faded, "is the covenant itself. This is not legally required. The trust documents cover all necessary legalities. But Mr. Monroe felt strongly that there should be something more, a statement of values and intentions that goes beyond legal language. Something to guide future generations in understanding not just what this trust is, but why it exists." She held up the covenant, handwritten on heavy paper, with translations in Narek's language running parallel to the English. At the bottom were signature lines for all the key participants. But at the top, in Jed's careful script, was a dedication. "For Sarah, who taught me that letting go is sometimes the only way to hold on. And for all those who come after, may this ground serve you as it has served those who came before." Elena read the covenant aloud. Her voice carried the weight of each carefully chosen word, the history of the land, its sacred designation, the philosophy of shared stewardship, the commitment to sustainable use, the promise to maintain it as neutral ground where differences could be bridged through common purpose. When she finished, Narek stood. "In my culture, when we make sacred agreements, we seal them not just with signatures, but with gifts, tokens that represent our commitment." He reached into a leather pouch and withdrew something wrapped in cloth. Unfolding it revealed a small silver bowl, intricately carved. "This has been in my family for 5 generations. I place it in trust for this land. May it hold water for those who gather here, as symbol of shared sustenance." He placed it on the table with ceremony, then signed the covenant. Lena and Mira stepped forward together. "We give this," Lena said, presenting the woven blanket they'd given Jed, the one that told the story of generosity and honor. "It belongs here, at the meeting ground, to remind all who come of what this place stands for." They signed beneath their father's name. Tom Hawkins produced a horseshoe, old and worn. "This was on the first horse I ever owned, 40 years ago. When we started having trouble with predators, Jed here gave me advice that saved my herd. Now we're building something that'll help a lot more than just my operation. This horseshoe represents the foundation, old but solid. May it bring luck to this venture." He signed, his hand steadier now. Martha Peterson offered a ledger book, handmade. "For recording the history of this place," she said. "All the meetings, decisions, people who come and go. Someone should write it down so future folks know the story." One by one, the others came forward. Some brought gifts, some just signed with spoken words of commitment. Leonard Cutler offered historical maps of the region. Sheriff Mackay pledged official support and protection. Each rancher in the cooperative added their signature and their promise to honor the land and its purposes. Finally, Elena looked at Jed. As primary steward and the one who initiated this trust, your signature completes the covenant. Jed took the pen. His hand hovered over the paper for a moment. This was it, the final step. Once he signed, everything changed irreversibly. No going back, no reclaiming ownership. The land would belong to the trust, to the community, to the vision they'd all committed to. He thought about Sarah, about the girls collapsed in the desert, about copper carrying them to safety, about 200 donkeys appearing like a miracle, about water flowing from dry ground, about all the impossible things that had happened because one choice, one moment of giving away everything had set in motion a chain of events that led here. He signed his name, Jed Monroe, in letters that would remain on this document long after he was gone, marking the moment when one man's loss became a community's gain. Narek placed his hand over Jed's on the table. It is done. The meeting ground is established again, sacred ground preserved, our two peoples, your community and mine, joined in purpose. 3 peoples, Leonard Cutler corrected gently. Don't forget the ones who came before, whose sacred ground this was first. They're part of this too, even if they're only present in memory and history. 3 peoples then, Narek agreed. Past, present, and future. All meeting here. Elena gathered the documents, preparing them for filing. But before she could, Tom suggested something. Seems like we should mark this occasion proper-like. Not just with signatures. We should go to the land itself, have a ceremony there, make it real. Everyone agreed. Within an hour, a caravan was heading toward Jed's ranch. No, not his ranch anymore. The sacred ground, the meeting place, the land that belonged to everyone and no one. As they traveled, Jed rode Copper beside Narek's black horse. The sun was high and bright. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions. And for the first time in years, Jed felt like he was riding toward something instead of away from loss. Riding toward a future he'd helped create by learning to let go. They gathered at the new well, the one Zara had found by listening to water moving beneath stone. It seemed fitting, this place that had appeared when it was most needed, that represented abundance emerging from apparent emptiness. Narek's people had brought drums and wooden flutes. They played old songs, melodies that had traveled across generations and continents, carried in memory and voice. The sound drifted across the desert, mingling with the evening breeze. Jed stood at the center of the gathering, uncomfortable with the attention but understanding its necessity. This wasn't about him, not really. It was about marking a moment, creating memory, establishing this place in everyone's hearts as something sacred and shared. Zara came forward carrying a clay vessel filled with water from the new well. "Water is life," she said simply. "We share it freely, as we will share this land. Let all who drink from this well remember, what we take, we give back. What we receive, we pass on." She drank first, then passed the vessel to Narek. He drank and passed it to Jed. Around the circle it went, each person taking a sip, each one acknowledging the covenant through the simple act of sharing water. When the vessel had made its full circuit and returned to Zara, she poured the remainder onto the ground. "For the earth," she said, "which feeds us all and asks only that we care for it." The ceremony was simple but profound. No fancy speeches, no elaborate rituals. Just people acknowledging their connection to land and to each other. It felt right in a way that all the legal documents, for all their importance, had not. As the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in impossible oranges and purples, people began to disperse. Some of Narek's tribe stayed to set up camp. They'd remain for a few weeks, helping to establish the initial operations of the trust. The ranchers headed back to their own properties, making plans to return for training sessions. Martha and the town delegation climbed into their vehicles, already discussing how to spread word about what had been accomplished. Tom Hawkins lingered, walking with Jed toward the house. "You know what you've done here?" he asked. "Made things complicated?" Jed suggested with a slight smile. "You've given people hope," Tom replied. "In a world where everything seems to be about what you can grab and hold on to, You showed a different way. You're going to inspire people, Jed. This story is going to spread. I just did what felt right, Jed said. That's exactly why it matters. After Tom left, Jed found himself alone at Sarah's grave. The cottonwood tree's shadow was long in the fading light. He sat with his back against the trunk, as had become his habit. We did it, he told her. Not the way we planned 30 years ago, but something better, I think. This land will outlast me now. It'll serve people long after I'm gone. That's worth more than any deed of ownership. He could almost hear her response. I told you so. Took you long enough to figure it out. He smiled, wiping at his eyes. Yeah, well, I'm a slow learner, but I get there eventually. The next morning, work began in earnest. Erin started training sessions with local ranchers who wanted to learn about donkeys. Zara and her team began mapping the entire property's water resources. Lena set up a small area in the barn as a documentation center, beginning the record. Martha had suggested writing down the history, the decisions, the vision. Jed moved through it all with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He was still learning about donkeys, about cooperative management, about how to balance multiple groups' needs and interests. But he was learning alongside others, not struggling alone. That made all the difference. 2 weeks later, Narek's caravan prepared to move on. They'd done what they came to do, established the trust's initial operations, trained Jed and others in donkey management, helped plan the next phase of development. But their life was movement, and it was time to continue their circuit. The morning of their departure, Narek presented Jed with a gift, a small leather-bound journal, similar to the one Jed had kept for 30 years. For the next chapters, Narek said, you have finished one story, now you begin another. Will you come back? Jed asked, though he already knew the answer. Every year, Narek promised. This is our home now too. We will return to check on our investment, he smiled. And to visit our friend who taught us that some cowboys still understand what really matters. As the caravan moved out, 200 donkeys flowing like water across the landscape, Jed stood watching until they disappeared. 50 of the animals had stayed behind the foundation herd for the Sacred Ground Trust's operations. They grazed peacefully, already settling into their new home. That evening, Jed opened the new journal Narek had given him. On the first page, he wrote, Today begins year 1 of the Sacred Ground Trust. I am 64 years old. I own nothing, and I am wealthier than I have ever been. He paused, then added, Sarah was right. What we give away never really leaves us. It circles back in forms we never expected. I gave away a horse and received an abundance I couldn't have imagined. I gave away ownership and received purpose. I gave away control and received community. This is what true wealth looks like, not what you hold in your hands, but what lives in your heart and the hearts of others. He closed the journal and stepped outside. The desert stretched endlessly under a sky so full of stars, it seemed impossible they could all fit. Somewhere in that vastness, a caravan was moving toward its next destination. Somewhere, 2 sisters were telling the story of a cowboy who walked. Somewhere, the future was being written by choices made today. And here, on sacred ground that belonged to everyone, an old cowboy who'd learned the hardest lesson of all, that letting go is the only way to truly hold on, stood ready for whatever came next. The measure of his life wouldn't be in acres owned or dollars saved. It would be in water flowing, in animals thriving, in people gathering, in land preserved, in community built. It would be in having given away everything and receiving back a legacy worth more than any deed could convey. True wealth, finally understood,